Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch. My guest today is Ben Cobley, former Labour Party activist turned journalist and author of a new book titled The Progress Trap, The Modern Left and the False Authority of History. We spoke about why progressivism is a really attractive ideology, not least because it offers a sense of certainty, a feeling of being part of grand historical projects, a feeling that you will be on the right side of history, that history is going to judge you positively in the same way that St. Peter would judge you positively at the pearly gates, and all the long Christian history that is feeding into this. We spoke about, though, the ways that actually the progressive project has had some dark episodes which have been forgotten. For instance, the proponents of eugenics in the early 20th century were very self-consciously progressive, and why progressivism as a really quite totalitarian ideology, the idea that absolutely everything in society is geared towards this goal of progress, change, is actually very dangerous, particularly when it's based on false priors, which it is. And yet this ideology has been embraced so enthusiastically by Western elites. We debated at the end whether or not it might be drawing to a close, whether or not the vibe shift is really happening and is going to consign this ideology to history. Let's see. The extended version of the episode, as ever, is available at louiseperry.substack.com, and you can find everything else associated with the podcast there, including bonus episodes, the chat community, old episodes, the writing that I do, some of which I think I mentioned in today's episode. Yeah, all that good stuff, louiseperry.substack.com. Ben, what is the progress trap?
Well, really, the progress trap is about the idea of progress, obviously, but it's not so much what progress says, what it means literally. It's really about what it does, sort of how it fits into our existential bloodstream, really of our society. So, I mean, I talk about it as a sort of way of manufacturing authority. So, for example, I'd say you have two very general forms of progress in our society, of how we use the word. One is, I think, what most people, just everyday people understand is it's just the basic progress is improvement over time. And what could be controversial about that? It's just, seems like a basic tautology. And to be a progressive is just someone who believes in that. So you will see a lot of people using the word progressive just to describe something good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's obviously quite convenient for the ideological progressives, which is the other kind, which is where it's a theory of history, really. And it's a theory of history actually improving in fact. So on one hand, you have progress as a description of something improving, and then you have the progressive ideology, which is actually saying that things are improving, have improved, and will improve in some sort of way. Obviously you have, bumps along the way. And that has all sorts of incredible implications, actually. And that's what I think, explore in the book. Like I say, how it fits into our society, how it works in our language. And the main thing, I think that the main sort of branching out of it is how it gives us actually authority ourselves. If you know the progress of history, if you know the journey from past to present to future, and this is not just of one sort of little sort of speciality, it's the whole of everything, the generality, the totality. That is a huge thing to even assume that you might have. Mm-hmm. It's really a huge attraction of authority to yourself. And naturally, this is just really attractive. It's really seductive, and not just for ourselves, but for other people. It's a complicated old world, isn't it? And, to have this comfort that someone that we know or that we look up to just seems to get it all and seems to understand it all is just really nice and attractive. And once you have that, you don't really have to think so much anymore. You can just actually do politics. Actually, that's one of the themes in the book. It allows this kind of assumption of knowledge of history for you to actually do a bit of kind of pure politics. And, you're using the language of, assuming that what's going to happen, that this will be the right course and these people are wrong and need to be stopped. I've talked for quite a while there about it, but I think that kind of hopefully sums it up, that this is actually a trap that, like I say, it's attractive, it's seductive, and there are some maybe positive features of it too. It gives us confidence, which sometimes can be obviously a good thing, but it opens the way to all sorts of authoritarianism, oppression, nonsense. The denial of knowledge. Once you assume the whole of history, actual knowledge, actual reality is kind of irrelevant to an extent if you already know it.
I have a meme saved on my phone. My phone reel is photos on my phone is exclusively baby photos and memes. And one of my favourites is the y-axis is progress, and the x-axis is time, and it's basically like flat, and then it suddenly goes up, and the inflection point is labelled anal sex invented and Richard Dawkins writes The God Delusion. And after those two things happen, it's like whoosh, wow.
That's quite something. You shocked me there.
Yeah. I didn't compose the meme. I just saved it because I found it funny, and because there's a very serious point there, which is yes, this shape of history that is being described by this ideology is really crazy. Actually, it's really crazy.
And I'm glad you raised that, actually, because I wanted to discuss with you, having read at least some of my book. I don't know if you've read it all, and sort of transpose it onto your work. Because I don't focus so much on the personal life and the, family life, marriage and sex life, but it's all completely relevant. What I talk about here and the attraction of authority to yourself. You write about Hugh Hefner, of course, and that I think very much sort of applies to him. He's talking about how porn is an improvement in society and a liberation of both men and women through sex and through more and more sex and more better sex. It's not just, oh, we're enjoying it more. This is good for the whole of society. It's very much the same sort of story.
Yeah, once you start noticing how often people use this model of history, at least rhetorically, you see it everywhere. I mean, people are constantly talking, completely. And particularly when it comes to sex and relationships and stuff, people are constantly talking about being behind, being ahead, going forward. Like this assumed shape to what's happening, and it's assumed as well that it's basically it's all just along one dimension. So the way that I interpret the sexual revolution as being a combination of good and bad, like being a big historical event and it really upending social relationships and so on, you can't fit that within this unidimensional model, which is all about basically the line go up, and yet people will still talk as if that's real.
It's remarkable and remarkably crazy, isn't it?
Yeah.
To think that even as far as they've gone, or we've gone, because it is in our existential bloodstream. And I think, you talk about it, Mary Harrington talks about it, it's something that we've grown up with, really. And it's one of the fascinating things I've found, looking into this book and writing it. And then even since, as like you say, just how these assumptions are everywhere.
Yeah.
Really virtually everything happening in like public life seems to have some sort of progressive dimension in, the way that participants, politicians, businessmen, civil servants, media people, artists, everyone, the way they talk about things is kind of leaving with these assumptions.
Yeah.
But yeah, sort of briefly going back to it, I went on a tangent there, but yeah, with the sexual revolution, the idea that it's got further to go. And I guess this is partly where the whole trans thing is. And is it transhumanism? That's one of the phrases here, that of remaking the body and making the body so much better and more based on choice.
Yeah.
And spending lots and lots of money on that and gaining the state in. So that's continuing on this upper trajectory.
So I wonder if one of the things, the historical events that has generated this model, this progressive model of history, is basically the Industrial Revolution, is that there are some dimensions along which the progress narrative is sort of true. So one good example would be something like child and infant mortality. Like if you look at that graph across history, you basically do see, like, to our minds, shockingly high levels of child mortality absolutely everywhere, right up until the Industrial Revolution, and then it starts to plummet, and then eventually, and we're now at the point where even in the third world, child mortality rates are very low. So that, in that instance, that graph of progress is basically true, and like maybe we might even reach the point where that goes still. I mean, it's hard now to reduce child mortality lower because it's already so low, but like theoretically, maybe one day it gets to zero. And there are other examples like, I don't know, abundance of energy, or
I wouldn't say that necessarily. I mean,
no, but I mean, like, up until now is what I'm saying. Like, that if you plotted history from when records begin to 2025, there are some graphs that would basically show that shape, and they're all to do with technology, really, and they really are just standing on the shoulders of the Industrial Revolution, which was just this astoundingly important historical event.
Yeah.
And I wonder if people have basically got confused between that, which is real, and the social and political aspects of it. That we assume that because anything that's kind of tracked with that technological progress must also be progress in its own way. I don't know. Maybe I'm being too...
No. It's an interesting thought. It's not one that I specifically address in the book, but I definitely think there's something in that. And it does fit into a wider argument, I think, about just as different types of progress did take hold, technological, industrial revolution, like you say, you could have the agricultural revolution, all sorts of, other aspects, I think, just with the Enlightenment, science knowledge. I mean, I guess that feeds into it. But I think a lot of aspects of life have got better. Yeah, certainly. And as language develops to deal with that, and people talk about them a lot, they're humongously important, then it becomes, like a general way of talking about things, and naturally theorists get excited, people writing stuff get excited and say this is a more general thing, that we've got general improvement. I mean, in the book, one of the arguments is that progress in practice is often tied to people's interests. And sometimes, there's the aspect of things improving for the individual, for the self. And then beyond that, there's the group. And then it's just so attractive to grab off the shelf a sort of an explanation of improvement in the general interest, especially sociological, and sort of tie that to your own group and your own participation in that group. And that's how I talk about the identity politics, especially nowadays, but also in the future. Obviously Marxism with a working class, and then against the bourgeoisie, kulaks, all the rest of it. So their role is to lose out in history, and then the proletariat is to win. But in practice, it's the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's the vanguard. And you just naturally, I think it's just the basic existential logic of it, that you attach your own interests in getting more power, say Marxists, getting more power in society to society improving. And then you have to do all this sort of massive work to try and make society look as if it's improving as well.
Yeah.
When it doesn't work. And I think with our, the woke revolution, we're very much at that stage now, where it's like, well, hang on, things seem to be getting worse. There's more antagonism. Even if you're really left wing, even woke, it's like, well, for example, in this country, we've got the Reform Party, Nigel Farage surging, Labour Party disappearing, in the polls, and then in America you have Trump, and all across Europe, similar right wing revolts. It's not working. So there is a lot of questioning going on.
Yeah, and it's a real challenge to the model. I mean, I think that you quote the quote that I remember from your book is Sadi Khan after, I want to say, Trump's second victory or some event like that, some destabilizing event, where he says, progress isn't inevitable. Sometimes we get these kind of setbacks, but we will return. Don't worry, we'll get back on track soon enough. It's sort of arc of the universe bending towards justice kind of view.
Yeah, it's very much a sort of a reassurance message that he's giving to all Londoners.
Yeah.
That it's going to be okay. We're still here. We're going to fight against this and we're going to win.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
I mean, you're right. I think the phrase that you use quite a few times in the book, which I thought was really good, is this idea of historical destiny. Like if the progressive narrative is true, that does mean that the progressives have historical destiny on their side, which is, of course, where all the wrong side of history, right side of history comes from. It's like this future court which will determine in your favour, even if you have these moments of setback.
Yeah, it's amazing, that sort of language. Obviously I've been saturated in it for a few years, writing the book. But people talk about the court of history and how history will judge you. Yeah. I quote Bonnie Greer, talking about history will judge Brexit voters and Trump voters as being on, and it's sort of, when you think about it seriously and look into it, as I did for my pains and maybe a bit slowly, but think about this phrase, history will judge, and it's very religious. If you replace history with God, you're looking at the final, the final judgment. For anyone to sort of take that authority onto themselves is very remarkable. And going back to the language, that history will judge. It's as if there's a history in the future which will be singular, and it will be exactly what they think now. That's an exact progressive ideology. What I think now will be what all historians think in the future. The one version of history will judge you and everyone else, and it'll save me and my colleagues, and it will damn you. Just remarkable. But I find it so interesting, and this is one of the, I hope one of the themes in the book is how not many people really consider themselves overtly and will say, I'm a progressive, or, have a worked out, belief system, conscious belief system of progressive ideology, but it's just something that they just pick up that just seems to fit. And I think that religious aspect helps with that. These are just sort of familiar styles, ways of telling a story about the world and about ourselves and our place in it. And, like I said before, they're comforting, and, they're attractive, seductive, and make us feel powerful. And actually, if people go along with it, they are impressed, well, then they are powerful.
Yes, it's a very interesting point that this idea of being judged by history, history is this singular thing. Like there's no space within that idea for people in the future changing their minds about things and having the same kind of fluctuations that we've had for all of human history in terms of ideology. That's just not accommodated. And I think that you're right that there is a religious aspect to it. It's either the moment of, St. Peter at the pearly gates, like that's one singular moment when you might be judged, or it's, I guess, the resurrection or something. But yeah, there is almost the expectation of some event in the future, but being irreligious, progressives they don't have that framework available to understand what that future judgment might look like.
Yeah, no, in the second chapter, which is, if my memory serves me right, it's called Taking the Place of God. In that, I talk about how, in many ways, people talk about progressivism or wokeism or whatever as a new religion, and I looked at this and got some good advice, especially from my editor actually on this, who's a Christian and corrected my faults. You've got the Christian story in many ways, or maybe the style, I use that word, is being replicated through a lot of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But it's with the specifics and a lot of the inconvenient observances, doctrines taken out.
Yeah.
So you don't actually have, Jesus dying on the cross. So you take him out, you don't bother about any cross, and you insert George Floyd under the knee of a Minneapolis policeman.
Mm-hmm.
And then he sort of serves in a Jesus-like role, shining a light. He's dying for the sins of a racist society and drawing us into a better future. And you find that sort of model being recreated all the time, through different individuals and groups, especially, what I call the system of diversity, the favor groups in that. So obviously black people, there's a consistent way of treating black people now as victims in that way. But also in quite in a religious way. And there's, like Christianity, there's the future-based temporality as well, which is, that better things will happen in the future, either just steadily through the incremental, actions of history or God, or through, the ruptures of revolution. So you've got that, and then, like I say, with the, that terminology, the history will judge, as sort of the last judgment. So it's the style, but without, like I say, the difficult stuff of going to church and actually observing, certain doctrines. It's just sort of like a kind of pick and mix, really.
Yeah.
And it depends more on politics and consensus forming, really, about who's going to play these roles.
Yeah, G.K. Chesterton wrote about this, of course, right? Like this idea of when you untether some of these ideas from.
Of course, he's got that famous quote, isn't he? Which I think I only came across after I'd finished my last draft or something, which is almost perfect. Anyway, I interrupted you.
I can't remember the exact quote, but it's something about kind of the virtues run amok.
Yeah, that's right. The modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad. The virtues have gone mad because they have been isolated from each other and are wandering alone. That's exactly along the lines of what I just said. Thus, some scientists care for truth, and their truth is pitiless. Thus, some humanitarians only care for pity, and their pity, I am sorry to say, is often untruthful.
Yeah.
Just great.
Nailed it.
Yeah. Oh, good old GK.
A long time ago as well.
Yeah, no, I've just come across the quote. I haven't actually read any G.K. Chesterton, of course. He had another wonderful quote, actually, which, again, I don't think I used.
The thing I found from reading G.K. Chesterton at length is he can be quite strange to read as a modern reader. The bits that have been remembered as being really great, so like Chesterton's Fence famously, some of these quotes about Christianity, they work really well for a modern reader as standalone. And then when you read some of his longer stuff, it all gets very Victorian. You need to be quite used to reading Victorians to get through it. Yeah,
no, I started reading Father Brown and I just actually didn't like it. But I found this quote. This will be my last Chesterton quote. The whole modern world has divided itself into conservatives and progressives. The business of progressives is to go on making mistakes. The business of the conservatives is to prevent the mistakes from being corrected. And that is just, for me, the story of our Conservative Party. In their last government period, they basically just sort of, they sort of sat around.
Yeah.
Didn't really do anything.
Just slightly slowed down the process.
Yeah.
The thing, of course, that Chesterton, the form of progressivism that he was most agitated about in his day, or one of the things he was most agitated about, was eugenics. And he has a whole book, Eugenics and Other Evils, which I have in the shelves behind me somewhere. And that, of course, is an inconvenient element of the history of progressive thought, because this was espoused by people who really, really self-consciously understood themselves to be progressives. And I think that, having read the contemporary sources, the best way really of understanding eugenics in the early part of the 20th century is like environmentalism is now, like an ideology based on scientific ideas, which was enormously popular among people who understood themselves to be on the right side of history. And then, of course, that's not how it ended up, because now eugenics is basically a slur. And I think if anything, that people overuse and misuse the word eugenics all the time, because it's so loaded with negativity, and particularly with association with Nazism, of course, that you can just hurl it at anything you don't like, and then that's that. It's used almost. It's not as badly misused as fascism, but it's close
like kind
to
of used in relation to anyone who thinks there is a genetic aspect of human behaviour.
Yes,
it's almost like they're implying the need for eugenics, which is actually, I'm jumping off one a little bit here, but I tend to think that's an assumption which is leavened by progressive assumptions, and that if you know some certain facts about something, well, that naturally leads to a course of action,
right.
with no,
it demands intervention.
With no process. It's just, there's an absolute knowledge there.
Yeah.
Sociological knowledge. There are no increments. There's no degrees of, no, it's a bit of this, it's a bit of that.
Right.
No, it's just like, right genetics, right eugenics. There we go.
Yes.
That may be unfair. I mean, it's not an area I've looked into very much.
Like the expression, I think it was Sidney Webb maybe, or one of the other Fabians, whose motto when it came to politics was interfere, interfere, interfere. And it's exactly this idea of having this shaping ideology which rushes everyone towards this goal. And eugenics was a perfect example of this.
Yeah, and it invests the individual with absolute authority, if they really take it seriously. And that's the thing, there are different levels of progressives who take, this stuff more or less seriously. And the Webbs, I think, were pretty up there, weren't they?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, that was almost high noon.
Yeah. And of course, one of the mistakes that eugenicists in the early part of the 20th century made is they didn't actually understand genetics very well. They didn't even have the word gene until quite late in the piece. And so they, for instance, often assumed that some things were heritable that weren't, like homosexuality is one example. Homosexuality is only very slightly heritable. It's probably to do with uterine environment or something. I mean, it's still fairly mysterious, but like they were wrong, and they were wrong about quite a lot of things. I think there is something inherently dangerous about people who have this level of drive towards this ideological goal, which is all-consuming. It is quite totalitarian almost, like the idea that every part of society needs to be harnessed to this program. And not least because if you get your priors wrong, even one prior slightly wrong, then everything is going to go wrong. If you're then setting out on this sort of
that's for actually a genuine progressive believer who is not cynical. And my book tends to the belief that cynicism just can't help but seep in, interest and belief kind of merge. But I think, there definitely are these people out there, that really, at least at one stage, maybe earlier on in their lives, they're real true believers, and there's a kind of magnificence about them as they take it seriously and they properly push it out.
Yeah, yeah.
And like you say, in those circumstances, if you get certain assumptions wrong, well then, you're going to come a cropper.
Eventually. I mean, I think that what we've seen across the 20th century and into the 21st is it does actually take quite a while for this stuff to play out. So you have people, do you know this, do you remember Raymond Williams, the Marxist literary critic? And he has this model of history, which is different but interesting. where you have these kind of multiple streams running simultaneously. So you have the old guard passing out, and you have the new guard, and you have the counterculture, and whatever. You have these like multiple layers within the political structure, and they're always in conflict with one another. And so what you see at any one moment is the product of that conflict. And I think that with, say, the sexual revolution, it took a while for the people who had basically grown up in a pre-contraceptive era to die. And so for a period you had Mary Whitehouse coexisting with Hugh Hefner or whoever, and they were in conflict. But once the Mary Whitehouses are gone, that's when the sexual progressives can attain much more power and have much more influence. So it basically takes like 50 years for this stuff to play out.
Yeah, no, definitely. But also they need those opponents.
Yeah.
To riff off, to have something to fight against.
Yeah.
Once they're gone, then they start to become the target.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
Although, like you say, this happens over a period of many decades.
Or worse, even, it becomes apparent that they were wrong. So like once their program is implemented and it doesn't work, right? Like I think that one of the reasons, for instance, why people are now, I saw a really interesting survey recently looking at attitudes towards pornography across the generations. And it was basically a U shape, so that older people think it's bad. Gen X millennial maybe think it's quite good. And then the younger people, the one who've actually been raised on internet porn, they think it's as bad as the old people do. There's like and I think it's because those are the youngsters who've actually learnt the hard way. Like they've actually been exposed to this stuff from childhood and the hardcore internet stuff as well, not just Playboy magazines. And so they've reached a different conclusion from people slightly older than them. So like basically they've lived it and they've decided, hang on.
I mean, I don't know about that, but I would guess there's an element of general rebellion as well.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true as well.
Against what they've been presented with. And the way that, we have a society that's always demanding change and transformation. And now, if you're doing that, you're demanding change and transformation against, the whole progressive, hegemonic, hyper-liberal, etc. system.
They could theoretically be even more radical. They could have just pushed even further towards the left than the Gen X and millennials did. But and some of them do that.
Reminds me just briefly of I saw Keir Starmer said the other day in response to another thing going wrong, said further and faster.
Oh my goodness.
It's very much, hammer it more.
Did you see that Labour Party poster that came out just before the local elections?
The one of the countryside.
Yeah, exactly. And what was the slogan?
Change. It was...
Britain needs change.
Yes.
Something like that.
Yeah, it was a photo of pristine English countryside saying, "Bring change to Britain."
And we think, no, please.
As if, it's the most beautiful scene, there are no houses in it. It's fields, rolling countryside.
I know, as if gorgeous, that's the thing we want changed.
Gorgeous sunny day, and bring change to Britain in capital letters, I think it said.
Yeah.
As if this is the very thing we want to change and get rid of.
Yeah.
But it's amazing. I've got some more of these quotes. Starmer, we're moving in the right direction. I will go further and faster to make that happen. And Bridget Phillipson on her education reforms. Labour will deliver a broader, richer, future-facing curriculum. Classic, progressivism there. The conference slogan, give Britain its future back, which is really weird when you actually think about this, decontextualize from, progressive assumptions, give Britain its future back. As if it hasn't got a future now, but now we're around. It's a completely different way of seeing time.
If you didn't know the context, you'd almost think that we were like averting nuclear apocalypse or something like that. Like we don't currently have a future because we're all about to die, and the only thing that we can do to have our future returned to us is to avert that mass death. But that's not what they mean.
No, they just mean sort of, doing a few little, I don't know what they haven't already done yet.
Well, if you pressed them for they'd say like cut NHS waiting times or something anodyne like that. But then I think that I think deep down it has a lot more to do with rejecting the old enemies of nationalism in particular.
Yeah, definitely.
And Christianity.
I mean, it's very much the identity politics thing, the progressive identity politics thing, which was subject to my first book, and there's a lot of it in this second book as well, but more in relation to specifically progressive ideas, and it's just completely in their bloodstream. I mean, I was in the Labour Party for 6 years, from 2010 to 2016. No accident that year. It was
yes, that's when Corbyn
significant year. Well, it was
Brexit, but also
Brexit,
when did Corbyn become leader? Remind me.
Corbyn was, I think, a few years before that. Let's see, Miliband probably was till 2015. I don't know exactly, but Corbyn had been around for a while.
Yeah,
and he was a real negative for me. But then there was Brexit, and it was like I was a Brexit voter.
Yeah.
And it was just all these people just coming out saying the most awful things.
Yeah.
And very much in a progressive assumption way, and with identity politics at the fore. And it's just completely remarkable. And this is the world they live in. It was one thing in that sorry for going to that first book, that the tribe, but I looked through the rule book. I'd been a Labour Party branch secretary, so I encountered the rule book in trying to organise meetings, and you had to sort of engineer them to have a certain number of women in different positions, which when you've only got a few members who actually turn up at meetings, it was kind of really difficult to actually do that. But you had to demand someone actually took a role against their will. So I looked through the rule book, and I just did that Control F thing when you kind of look for all these keywords, and just found women, gender, race, ethnic, all these words just cropping up all the way through the rule book, which is dictating how the party organises itself. Actually the body, what it is. And then there were 2 mentions of class in the whole thing, and it was like kind of 96 of some of the other. And that just kind of summed it up. This is what it is, and this is, as a Labour leader, you could decide, well, I'm not too keen on this stuff, like kind of assuming that all sort of white English people are, inherently bad and need to be re-educated. But you can't actually really do anything about it because it's just the body of the party. Yeah. It's how all the interest groups feeding into you work. Yeah. So looking at that, I completely lost my faith that Labour could ever change.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I was a Labour Party member too, and I left for much the same reason. It is really curious that the party that was founded to represent the newly enfranchised working classes, well, it was already founded, but attained power through that, has basically abandoned class. I mean, not entirely. Obviously, you will still.
They still talk about they use that language, but they don't have the interest groups. They don't. I mean, the working class hasn't got any organisation. It hasn't literally got any political power. Yeah, there's no. Well,
it's supposed to be trade unions.
Yeah, well, that's obviously just not the case for the most part now.
Yeah,
I mean,
nowadays.
It's principally public sector unions, and people are paid very well.
And actually, I mean, the white working classes are just the most reviled group, really. One of the most reviled groups in British politics. And often really directly. I mean, there's all these famous examples of Emily Thornberry and whatever. And obviously you have, this is across the West. In America, it's the basket of deplorables. In Australia, it's the Bogan. Everywhere kind of has this phenomenon of white working class men in particular being really reviled.
It's amazing, isn't it, the way it's a structural thing.
Yeah.
Actually.
It must be. It can't, I mean, I don't know. I go back and forth on this all the time. Like, I would tend to say that, there must be something material going on. And there are interesting material things. clearly going on in terms of like the loss of male jobs through deindustrialization. And I've written a few times before about, I think that to some extent modernity makes male strength redundant or partially redundant in a way that is really bad for men socially and politically. So I think that is all happening. But then at the same time, I just think like you can't ignore the ideological factor, because this ideology is really powerful and people will sign up for it, by which I mean progressivism. People will sign up for it radically against their material interests and will opt for things that are objectively crazy for the country, for themselves personally, because they're driven by this ideology.
I don't necessarily agree, though, although it may be a sort of a weird point, for want of a better word. But I don't necessarily agree it's against people's material interests. I mean, maybe the whole of politics and society going that way definitely is against their material interests. But actually, you know, this is a have a job or not have a job sort of situation. If you go against the progressive identity politics in the workplace a lot of the time now, you know, you're very likely to be in trouble. And I've heard a lot of people. I mean, there have been a lot of cases, but I've heard a lot of people just tell me, you know, I just don't say what I think at work anymore.
That's true. I suppose that explains the kind of the Harville's greengrocer people. So the people who just go along with it and say the right things. But I can think, I will not name any names, but I can think personally of people that I know who are absolutely true believers, really passionate about progressivism, and are being screwed by these policies, basically. Like, can't afford a house because of mass immigration, face, like, say, terrible sexual harassment or homophobia from people from parts of the world that are very misogynistic and homophobic who've suddenly rocked up, right? Who, I just think, why do you not see that the policy that you endorse hurts you? And I think the answer is just because ideology is that powerful sometimes.
Yeah, we're living in a sort of a world of meta sociology, really, aren't we? I mean, this is the word I used the other day. I'm not completely sure it makes sense, but I hope it does. Of a sociology which isn't actually analysing society, it's analysing a chimera of society, you know, an ideologically convenient one. And we're living in that sort of world with a lot of, you know, online life, but also like real life, you know, when we're down the pub with our friends, you know, you've got to keep conformity. I mean, I think that those narratives are under serious pressure now. But yeah, they're certainly still got their power. I mean, especially in London where I am.
Yeah, I think that's right. These narratives are under pressure. And I think the reason they're under pressure is because they're starting to play out. Like, progressives have basically had enough influence within government now for long enough that this stuff is starting to play out and people are actually seeing it and it's not theoretical anymore.
Yeah, and I think with, you know, what you mentioned of the mass immigration and a lot of men on the streets from radically different cultures, you know, much poorer cultures, but also, like you say, culturally very different, who just, you know, let's be honest, they simply don't know how it's appropriate to behave in a Western liberal society, especially to women.
Yeah.
And that is having very, very, I mean, let's not beat around the bush. I mean, very serious consequences.
Yeah.
I mean, for a lot of people, it's relatively, you know, relatively tolerable of getting, you know, more comments than you would otherwise have had. And I mean, even that is, it, you know, it threatens you. Just someone making comments, it makes you feel vulnerable. You don't necessarily want to go down that street, especially at night. You know, it affects actually your whole feeling of home. You know, the extension, you know, your home isn't just the four walls. It's the community and the society you live in, even the nation, you could say.
Yeah.
So it's having, you know, progressive ideology in that sense, and and all the infrastructures that are built around it of human rights law, equalities law, all that type of thing is now palpably having a major social and also economic influence. And I mean, I think you've got to try really hard not to just accept at least a part of it as true.
Do you remember that thing that Gus O'Donnell, famously, who was head of the civil service at the time,
G-O-D, God. That's what he was called.
Do you remember what he famously said to David Goodhart at a dinner? And then David quoted it in The Road to Somewhere about how he felt like his obligation as one of the most powerful people in the country was not to the people of Britain, but to the people of the world. He thought it was to maximise global welfare, not British welfare. And this, I think, is a widespread belief.
Yeah, there's quite a few other ex-senior civil servants who have said the same thing.
Yeah. Again, that's like... So quite a popular narrative on the right is to explain this with something like luxury beliefs, right? So that... And there is some truth to that. The idea is that for the elites, I don't mean like tippy-toppy elites, I mean like the upper middle classes, they benefit from mass immigration because they get cheap au pairs and they get cheap cleaners, and who cares about what happens in Rotherham, right? It's not completely untrue. There clearly is an extent to which you can cushion yourself through class, and this also applies to some of the sexual politics stuff, like Rob Henderson writes extensively about the fact that actually elite people tend to talk the 1960s, walk the 1950s when it comes to their personal relationships. So it's not entirely untrue. But I do think actually, you know, I've lived in London for most of my life, not anymore. People all the time will face like directly bad consequences of their own politics. Like they do actually suffer for this, like from whether it be having their phone snatched or I came across some shocking examples in London of people who've had like terrible things happen to their children, like crimes committed against their children, and it hasn't budged them from their own false view of the world. And I don't know, I actually think that they believe it.
Well, I mean, in recent times, I've had the blessing or the curse, I think a bit of both, of listening, of overhearing the Radio 4 Today programme. So for people who don't know that, that's the main sort of morning radio show.
Most high status show. Yeah,
on a serious radio station that basically everyone in politics, I think, and high society sort of listens to as they're having their breakfast. And just getting to hear a lot of that, they're just they're in another world. They don't talk about what we've been talking about. You know, your family being exposed to much higher danger and crime rates, and the consequences of mass immigration. They barely ever talk about it. They pretty much like to talk about Trump and how bad he is. They talk about how bad Israel is. And these, of course, in a very much, you know, an overtly progressive framework. And they very rarely talk about domestic affairs, except for when someone's produced a report. So some high-up organization, generally well-funded, well-connected, you know, progressive leanings. So if you're living in that world, if you're listening to this for 3-4 hours a day, every day, that's actually the world that you're living in, almost more than the world outside. And I think knowing that the rest of your class, you know, the people that you go out with are listening to it too, just has a really powerful effect. It's unbelievable, and it's really, in a way, depressing, but completely remarkable.
I suppose the human mind is a powerful thing, and also, so to be fair to the people that I'm to some extent caricaturing, like the people whose lives are made worse by not being able to afford housing and crime and stuff, they would say that actually I'm wrong about mass immigration causing housing crisis, for instance. They would say, Like, they do tend to notice these bad phenomena, but they just have different explanations for it.
Yeah, they just basically exclude from the supply and demand thing.
Yeah.
Demand. It's just like, all right, demand doesn't exist. It's all about supply. We need more homes.
And it's not that they fail to notice crime, it's that they explain it as a consequence of like lack of community services and deprivation and things like that. So they don't think that tough on crime policies would solve it.
And it's not consistent, of course, because it's not saying, oh, culture is irrelevant. It's like the culture of these people is irrelevant, but then the culture of white working class people who vote reform, for example, is relevant.
Yeah, it's a very, or say everyone notices that the NHS is not working well and that public services in general are not working well, even though taxes are the highest they've ever been in peacetime. But the alternative way of explaining that, so I would explain that as a consequence of like the welfare state basically being a catastrophic idea. They would explain it as failing to tax billionaires and therefore underfunding these public services. And so the answer is the bankers, the bonuses, and these are just quite, I think that that's a really incoherent explanation, and also the explanation when it comes to crime and housing and so on.
But it's also comforting because it protects your identity.
Clearly loads of people find that persuasive.
Yeah, and progressive politics is a major part of people's identity, clearly. Just really knowing what's going on, really understanding politics, who should be in power, who shouldn't be, who's good, who's bad, is just core to people's identity. And it's, if you like, it's a mind-centered identity. If you like, a theory-centered identity, even if it's not actually having a theory which you've written down, it's in a theoretical style rather than in a, you're basing your account of reality on reality, what actually sort of happens in the world.
I mean, explaining reality is actually is hard. Like, we do have competing explanations as to why these things happen, and this is all very complex. So it's not as though
sociology is completely stupid and idiotic and should be abolished. It's like, it's a really valuable discipline to try and understand society.
Yeah, like something like trying to work out why housing is very expensive in a way that it wasn't a few decades ago. That's a legitimately difficult academic question. I think it's really unlikely that the progressive narrative is true because there seem to be so many holes in that narrative. But people really like it. I mean, you just go on to normie social media and people are very sold on the bankers, the bonuses. I tend to think,
it's like with progressive ideology, or I sometimes talk about the progressive way of being.
Yeah.
As in it's not so much an ideology. It's, it's more something you fit your life and identity around. And it's sometimes like there are two components to it. One is that kind of almost beautiful romantic yearning for a better world and to be happy, for everything to look good and feel good and resolved. And, you never have just feeling a bit down and a bit depressed of a day. And, never feeling anxious, which I tend to think is the human condition, is just to feel anxious. It's just all resolved, and progressive ideology, the style, resolves things. But also it has like a quasi-rational story. Like I said earlier, it's based on assumptions of knowledge and not just little pieces of expert knowledge about, how to fly a plane well, that's not little, that's big enough, but it's about the whole of everything. That's in the style of someone who knows. So it's got both the rational and the moral. So I don't know just how beautiful and attractive that is, just for someone, let's be sympathetic for someone who's just busy, has got a hard job, with a load of people they're working with who have the same type of beliefs. Why not just sort of fall into this lovely bath of bullshit?
Yeah. It's successful for a reason.
So on a level, and this was the case with my previous book, having a real go at the progressive identity politics, on a level I do sympathise with people for this. I mean, you said some of them are your friends and still are, and I'm really impressed that you've still got friends.
No, they tend not to regard me as a friend anymore. I think
you're just kind of clinging on.
These are people I know. I know in various capacities or have known in the past. Yeah. But I mean, I come as I've. This is sort of public information. Like I've come from this sort of milieu, and I have grew up reading The Guardian and whatever. So I do get it from the inside, which is I think part of the reason why I have sympathy for it. I can see why it's attractive as an ideology.
But that, I think, really helps in actually discussing it and explaining it, to actually have kind of been inside it. I tend to think a lot often with right-wingers that they don't quite get it because they can't put themselves in the shoes of these people.
You know what sometimes happens as well, I think, it's just my theory, that if you have done the travelling rightwards thing, which a lot of people do. I mean, even in other eras, it's normal for people to become more conservative as they get older. In cancel culture era, you're quite likely to be punished for this socially and professionally. And I think sometimes people can be so burned by that experience and so bitter about it that it actually makes them really venomous towards the ideology they used to endorse. And I try really hard not to do that, is what I'm saying. I don't feel venomous towards it. I see why it's attractive. I also just think it's wrong.
Yeah, no, I got a bit of that quite early on. Actually, the worst was when I was talking about patriarchy. Yeah, I was criticising patriarchy on my own blog writings, and I got some like horrific responses. And one especially, this. Someone online was threatening to throw knives in my face. And, it really sort of got to me, that did. And then I think a day or two afterwards, I found out that the account that said that, it was a girl she was 14 years old or something.
Really?
And it was just like that took the edge of it off it, actually. And that was, I guess, maybe a reason why I started to be more sympathetic. It's just like, hang on, this is just vulnerable people getting brainwashed, you could say. That's it's a strong word, because it's just like we all, at that age, we just hear something and we start believing it, don't we? And whether it's brainwashing, I don't know.
And I think the situation that a lot of people find themselves in, I mean, you talked earlier about how the material price that you pay for not abiding by this ideology is often losing your job, or it can be really disastrous, or losing your social network. And I think what quite a lot of people do, the Harville's greengrocer types, is that the benefits to them of abandoning false beliefs and replacing them with true beliefs. I mean, that's obviously, I would say that, but I think that's what's going on, right? The benefits to them are fairly marginal from doing that. I mean, like definitely. They might get a sense of kind of intellectual satisfaction, and maybe to some extent they might change their behavior in a way that is more self-protective or better, more in their interests. But generally those benefits are quite minor, whereas the costs to them, and they don't have the power, like as an individual, they don't have the power to alter this at scale. They only have the power to change their own behavior and maybe the people around them a little bit. Whereas the costs to them of adopting true beliefs and abandoning false ones are potentially catastrophic.
That's completely it. I mean, that's actually kind of getting right down to the situation of a person who has a choice.
Yeah.
Do they recognise reality and start going with it and risk all their pretty much all their social relationships, potentially their earning capacity? That is huge for anyone to countenance, and on that level, we should always sympathise with someone, to an extent, with someone who doesn't go that way. It's something I write about actually in the last chapter of the book, when I, try and address, how we should respond to like progressive hegemony. And it's like I talk about, the Rebel Alliance and how the Rebel Alliance is sort of composed of a lot of like outsider people, and they're often rebels and contrarians by nature, and they sort of come together over different issues and then disappear. And I quote Michael Linden talking about that we've got a sort of counterculture going on, but we need a counter establishment of actually sort of people who aren't just comfortable in just being against what is up there all the time, but actually want to recreate, create a new establishment to do things better. And it's just a huge task, I think. All sorts of different levels, institutional level, but what we were just talking about, the personal level, just even changing someone's mind. I mean, but on one level, at least we live in interesting times, and I think there will be more of this, of people actually changing, and the process of that changing will be very interesting, of people actually thinking seriously for themselves. And I can see a potentially, not definitely, but a sort of intellectual like revival, sort of revolution in a way.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.